I talked today with Chris Shelton. Chris is a former Scientologist and Sea Org member and is now a writer, consultant, podcaster, YouTuber, and advocate for critical thinking. In today's episode, we talk about how Chris was raised in the Church of Scientology and what led to his eventual departure. But there are many more cults out there than just Scientology, and we talk about how no one is immune to their charms. Chris tells us how to avoid falling into the traps that destructive cults set and the warning signs that show you might already be in one. In today's episode of Podcast for Inquiry, I bring you my conversation with Chris Shelton. Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. Chris Shelton, thank you for taking the time to speak with me today on Podcast for Inquiry.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I'm really quite happy to be doing this.
I've asked you to come on because you have you have an interesting personal story, and I like very much the work that you have done over the last several years. And I want to start with what I know of as your beginning. I mean, you had a life beforehand, but you got fairly involved with Scientology from a fairly young age, and then you left the church. So can you sort of tell us how you got involved, a little bit about Scientology and why and how you left?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I'm what's called a second generation cult member because I was raised in Scientology. My parents got involved with it when I was about 3 years old, and we used the principles and the language and all the terminology, and which is quite extensive. Growing up and learning these things in the same way somebody growing up in a Judaic or Christian household would learn all the dogma and the beliefs and everything, and just sort of accept that that's the worldview. And so L. Ron Hubbard's view of the world was my view of the world through my childhood. And so when I was 15 years old, I started officially doing church classes. There's class work and there's counseling work, or what they call auditing. And I was doing both, mostly working on class work. And then I graduated high school, and right out of high school, they recruited me to join staff and work for the Church of Scientology, which I proceeded to do for the next 8 years in Santa Barbara, California, where I worked at the church there. And then when I was about 25 years old, I signed the billion-year contract, and I went in for, I went all in, going down to LA, and I worked down there for another 17 years. So 25 years total working for the church at its, basically at its highest levels. And
you did you just say, I just want to make sure I heard you correctly. Did you just say it was a million-year or a billion-year contract that you signed?
I did. Yes. Many people have heard of the billion-year contract. And I always kind of try to insert that in the narrative as to the point where that happens. For me, it was, it's when you join the Sea organization, and not all Scientologists do that, but I did. And you sign a billion-year contract of dedicated devotion to Scientology.
So that, I mean, I guess a billion years is fairly short compared to the eternity of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but that's still a really long time. In your view, what's the difference between the Scientology beliefs that you were raised in and the in North America, predominantly Christian beliefs that people are raised in, with other minority faiths are present here as well. But there's the majority of people are Christian. The details differ, of course, but is there a fundamental difference between the Scientology view of the world and humanity's place in it, and the Judeo-Christian view of the universe?
Yes, there are vast chasms of difference between the two things. Probably the fundamental difference at a core level is that Scientology is addressing you as a spiritual entity and attempting to rehabilitate you or restore your spiritual abilities and perceptions so that you are basically like God. You are the goal is to become cause over life, where you are in the driver's seat and you are able to create or destroy matter, energy, space, and time at will. And you are at cause over matter, energy, space, time, life, and form. That's how Scientologists talk about it and think about it. Christianity is about subservience to a God figure who grants you salvation and grace through belief and through dedication and devotion to that God. And Scientology's God is you. So it's a very different flow, very different goal.
Well, I can see the appeal. Rather than simply be redeemed because I was born in sin, I get to become a god myself. I can see why that might be an appealing view. I remember that I think when I was in high school, this was like 30 years ago, and was when I first heard about Scientology, and they seem to be recruiting, or they seem to be very uh, set on celebrities that were Scientologists, sort of riding on the coattails of celebrity. I remember when I was a kid, there was a commercial on TV that said, "I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV," and then proceeded to advertise for some medical product. More recently, in the last couple of years, we've seen a whole slew of celebrity endorsements of various cryptocurrencies or crypto technologies. And was it just that some celebrities went into Scientology, or was there a deliberate attempt to recruit celebrities and then use that as an implicit or even explicit endorsement of you too can become a godlike figure if you join Scientology and rise to the highest ranks?
Oh, very much the latter. Very much. Scientologists are all about self-empowerment and improvement. And L. Ron Hubbard recognized all the way back in the 1950s the power and influence that celebrity brings to the picture. When you have a celebrity endorsing your products, you're automatically appealing to an incredibly larger base of people who will lend a sympathetic or friendly ear to your product because somebody they like, or some celebrity they adore is endorsing you. So that's something Madison Avenue picked up on many decades ago, and Hubbard rode that same concept in promoting Scientology. And he actually listed out celebrities he wanted gone after or wanted to be made part of Scientology. Then, as the 1970s came along, a very gung-ho Scientologist named Yvonne Jench just took it upon herself to start a network of Scientology churches that were dedicated exclusively to servicing or catering to Scientology VIPs and celebrity figures, people who have, by their very job or nature or position, vast amounts of wealth and influence in our society. So the celebrity center organizations of Scientology, the churches that are called or labeled celebrity centers, deal almost exclusively with celebrities. And the main one is in Hollywood, California, of course. So that is a very much a pillar of Scientology's success is celebrities. And this was most at first the one that really stepped out and really stepped forward and showed the power of celebrity in Scientology was John Travolta in the 1970s, when Saturday Night Live, or sorry, not Saturday Night Fever happened, and he and Grease and all of that. He was huge, and Scientology grew because of that. Then, of course, there was Tom Cruise, and now
Right.
Tom Cruise is sort of the celebrity poster boy of Scientology.
Now, I mean, they're both still making movies, but there seems to be a lot less focus today on their Scientology connections, and at least in pop culture, it really does seem to be on the wane. I know that Scientology for like 15 or 20 years tried to get recognized as a religion, formally recognized by the government of Canada as a religion in Canada. And that attempt failed. I live in Toronto, and Scientology either has or maybe at this point had a very large building in downtown Toronto, like 8 stories or so. And 20 years ago, it was an active building. There were always people on the corner willing to talk to you. It's been boarded up now for at least 5 years, maybe close to 10. When I look at Scientology in pop culture these days, it's usually as the butt of a joke, whether it's from Bowfinger from maybe 10 years ago. There was a movie called The Master, which really seemed to be about Scientology, although it didn't explicitly say that. And in a TV show called The Kaminsky Method, one of the supporting characters is a current, possibly ex, a little bit hazy Scientologist, but spent a good part of his life in Scientology. But it really was there as a comedic effect. Is it still a major force in society, or is it kind of on its way out and waning and just a vestige of what it used to be?
Oh, yeah. Scientology's never been what I would describe as a major force in our society, for sure. It's a pipsqueak, tiny little organization and always has been. But it exaggerates itself, for effect in a similar way to North Korea in a lot of ways, actually, on the geopolitical stage, right? It's kind of this pipsqueak bully nation that pops up and says awful, horrible things and does awful, horrible things. And people are like, oh, yeah, North Korea is still a thing, isn't it? And that's kind of what Scientology is in many ways. And the analogies don't stop there between North Korea and Scientology.
I spoke with someone about North Korea last year on Podcast for Inquiry. And I mean, it is the Hermit Kingdom, very, very small compared to the global population, but the human rights abuses that nation perpetrates on its citizens are fairly horrific. It was, I read our guest's book, and then speaking with her, it was quite I think an important but a harrowing conversation. When you say that the parallels don't stop there, is that what you're referring to? Is that type of abuse and lack of respect for people as humans?
Yes, very much so. I have said many times, in fact, that if the Church of Scientology were to accomplish its goals and take over a country or take over the planet, it would look exactly like North Korea. That's not just a toss-off statement. That's a considered statement. I've done a podcast about North Korea and got into the details of how North Korea became North Korea and the origin story and the tools of coercive control and the things that the leadership of North Korea has been doing for decades with the Kim family. Parallels almost everything that goes on in the Church of Scientology structurally, actually systemically. So it's not a toss-off comparative.
About 20 years ago, I was reading a collection of essays by Harlan Ellison, and he claimed in one of them that he was in the room when Scientology was born in the mind of L. Ron Hubbard. And again, this is according to what Ellison wrote. But they were all it was a room filled with science fiction pulp writers. They were all scrabbling to get by. This was before anyone was making any money, and they were wondering where their next meal was coming from. And Hubbard said, if we really wanted to make money, we would start a religion. And then he sketched out, tossed off a few ideas, and then I think it was half a decade later, Dianetics was published, which is the foundational text of Scientology. And since you were born and raised and steeped in Church of Scientology lore, I've always been curious: is there any truth to that, or, as has been posited sometimes, Ellison has been known to exaggerate sometimes, and is this a tall tale?
Well, I would not characterize that particular meeting as the birth of Scientology, because here's the thing: there are 3 anecdotes about Hubbard saying that to people. And Ellison's story is only one of those. I have
Okay.
another one where he was saying the exact same thing to his personal assistant in 1950 after Dianetics had been published, that he was gunning for religion and a religious experience or to create a religion. Because he said quite rightly that is where the money is at, and he wasn't wrong. There is a tremendous amount of money to be made.
Well, that was didn't Samuel Clemens say that the money is where the religion is where the money is? So he was just sort of channeling other authors from, I guess, half a century or so prior.
Absolutely. Plus observing the real world around him. I mean, this has been, televangelism was radio evangelism before television came around, and before that it was the traveling circus show of the religious evangelicals and the whole, that whole tour. So this has been a grift that's been going on for a very long time. And I call it a grift not because religious belief is a bad, horrible, awful thing, but it's what people do with it and how they take advantage of other people and use them for monetary gain or other kinds of influence and gain. And religion has always been a platform to do that. And Hubbard was noticing that and decided to get on that gravy train, and he pulled it off. He actually did create a church out of nothing. He created a church, and he grew it to an international organization, and he structured it around a kind of, if I'm being bold and blunt, he created a mafia-like structure, and he proceeded to extort a great deal of money and resources out of people for the rest of his life.
The way you're describing the church's behavior, it's clear that you're a former member, but you were born into it. You were raised in it. This was not just the foundation of your worldview and philosophy, but it also for decades was the source of your income. And there's a very popular saying by Upton Sinclair. I think I quoted this last year speaking with someone else. It is very hard to get someone to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it. And yet you left. Can you describe, I would like to hear from you why you left, why you would turn your back on your parents, your family, your community, your whole worldview up to that point. And I've heard that Scientology can be difficult to leave. They make it very hard for people in a number of ways. And if you can sort of share part of your story of why you made that decision, how you and the mechanics of how you left the Church of Scientology.
Yeah, absolutely. First off, let me correct your framing a little bit, because in the Church of Scientology, I made about $20 a week when I was in Santa Barbara, and about $50 a week max as a Sea Org member, because that's the pay.
You described yourself as an employee, so I made an assumption there. So
no worries.
Thank you.
Worries.
No, I appreciate I appreciate being corrected. It's good to know. I didn't realize that you were essentially volunteering.
Basically, that's exactly what I was doing. And in fact, funny you mentioned that, because the legally binding contract you sign to be a staff member for Scientology, whether it's at the city
contract.
What's that?
The billion-year contract?
No, there's a different one.
Okay.
There's the billion-year contract is a symbolic gesture. There is a legally binding contract that you sign to be a staff member at the Church of Scientology. Okay. And you commit yourself to a 2.5 or a 5-year commitment. And during that time, your exchange for working for Scientology is that you receive Scientology services for free. You get classwork and counseling, auditing for free.
Nice.
In exchange for your work.
I mean, nice in the sense that that's a nice deal for the church. It's like if I'm working for my company, I get a gift certificate for the company's products. That's
exactly
a great deal for the company, less so for the employee.
That's right. And of course, you only get those services after you have done your on-the-job training and any other training you need to do your work, because there's a whole slew and lineup of classwork that you have to do mandatory as a staff member, in addition to.
Just to be clear, when you're talking about training and classwork, that's all things that you have to pay for. That's not just your time and mental effort to learn. This is non-trivial amounts of money coming out of your pocket for each of these certifications.
As a public Scientologist, yes. As a staff member, all of this is free.
Right.
If you break your contract, then you're going to be paying for it. They keep tabs.
Okay.
This is called a freeloader bill. You're considered a freeloader if you come on staff, do a bunch of services, and then leave before your time is up.
Okay.
So this freeloader debt is something that's kind of infamous in Scientology, because they charge former members or people who used to work for them if they don't fulfill that 2.5 or 5 year commitment. And in the case of a Sea Org member, if you don't finish your billion-year commitment, like I did, then they're billing you for services. So I had 17 years of services I had done as a Sea Org member that I had to pay for after I left the Sea Org. Okay, so that's just the financial side. I just wanted to correct that little thing, because nobody in Scientology is making any money.
You're making $20 or $50 a week working for the Sea Org. You've been doing it. You said you did that for 17 years.
Yeah.
That's a long time. What made you change your mind from, I'm going to devote my life to this organization, to the Church of Scientology, to deciding to leave? That's a huge shift.
It was, and it took a long time for me to come to that shift. It was not a black and white sudden epiphany. It was really a 10-year road of doubts and reservations building up over time because of what I was seeing and experiencing. And I experienced physical abuse and a great deal of psychological abuse, food deprivation, sleep deprivation, really real psychosis-inducing kind of stuff, as well as a 3-year, prison program. I mean, there's an internal justice system within Scientology and within the Sea Org that is quite powerful and quite arbitrary. If you step out of line, you can find yourself in a great deal of trouble very, very quickly. And over, all the years I was involved, I stepped out of line a lot of times. Lots of people do. It's kind of hard not to when you're in a destructive cult situation where the rules are made to hem you in and imprison you. And that's Scientology in a nutshell. So I, would push back against some of these problems and issues over the years, and I would get pushed back on, and I would note that this was happening and see other people experiencing abuse, physical, psychological, financial. I saw people going bankrupt in Scientology, taking out mortgages, giving over their kids' college funds to pay for their Scientology services, and I thought, this is a bit much, I mean, I'm exaggerating for effect here a little bit, but I thought that there were problems and issues. And as time went on, these issues multiplied. And it finally dawned on me in about 2011 or so that about near the end of 2011, I realized that I was actually having to spend a good part of my day deceiving people. Scientologists or non-Scientologists, about the subject of Scientology, either to get them back on board or recover them if they had drifted from the faith, so to speak, or new people telling them about Scientology. I was having to tell them outright lies in order to make it acceptable, to make it seem palatable, to make it seem like it was a normal, usual, regular, perfectly ordinary religion doing perfectly ordinary things, because we weren't ordinary people doing ordinary things. We were Scientology, and Scientology gets up to all kinds of nonsense. So in order to justify that nonsense and that kind of existence, I had to tell myself an awful lot of lies. And over time, those lies started to wear thin as I kept seeing exception after exception and problem after problem being created by Scientology. And I finally went, I can't keep living my life this way. I'm telling more lies. The exact thought was, the realization that I am telling more lies on a daily basis than I'm telling the truth. And I
Wow.
never signed up for that. And
Yeah.
once you sort of realize, it's sort of the frog in the boiling water thing. It's like once you realize the water is boiling, you're like, oh, I got to get out of this. And that was the situation. It was a very slow
So
grind.
your job at the Sea Org, it was to bring people bring people back who were starting to stray, and now you were finding yourself in the situation where you were doubting, you were straying yourself. So did you keep it secret? Did you give voice to your thoughts? Like, obviously you eventually left, but when you realized that you were living a lie or perpetrating a set of lies, how did you translate that realization into the action of leaving, and what was the reaction from the Sea Org and the Church of Scientology?
Sure. Basically, I was still a believer in Scientology. I still thought L. Ron Hubbard knew what he was talking about, but I thought the organization had lost its way. I thought that maybe it could be corrected, but it wasn't my job anymore to try to correct it. I had been working for the church for 25 years at this point, right? 24.
Yeah.
I was kind of burnt. I'd been burnt. I'd been burnt out before, and I'd come back, and various things had happened. I had had a number of jobs in Scientology, and yes, recovering people back into the faith was one of the later jobs that I had. And through that job, I learned an awful lot of abuses that had happened to other people that I'd been clueless about. It's not like we talk about these things within the world of Scientology. All of this is very clamped down, and you can't be critical of the organization, and you can't be complaining or fault finding or saying something's wrong here. This is a cult situation. Everything is perfect all the time. And if it's not, then you're the problem, not the situation.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's kind of how things are in these groups. And so I did attempt to try to say some things to my then wife, to some other people, and they didn't want to hear it, right? Because a cult mindset is one where critical thinking has vanished. You cannot be critical of the subject that you are in an extremist mindset about. Those two things are mutually exclusive. Something I came to learn years later. So I wasn't being warmly received with my criticisms or my attempts to try to correct these problems. And I went, well, okay, this isn't working. I'm gonna have to leave. I gotta go. I gotta reset my life here. And I proceeded to do so. But I still wanted to actually be a practicing Scientologist. So instead of just taking off and jumping over the fence or running out in the middle of the night, I said, hey, look, I don't want to work for the Sea Org anymore. I still want to be a Scientologist. I put it in writing. I let my seniors and the people in charge know I'm formally requesting to leave. And there's a process. There's a procedure you have to go through. You get a confessional, or what's called a security check, where they check you over on the e-meter and make sure you're not, leaving with untold crimes or money or anything goofy like that. And I went through all that process, and it took me about 8 or 9 months to do that. It was a long, dragged out process.
Yeah.
And the Sea Org is a full commitment, by the way. I mean, for your audience, it's 24/7. I was all I was doing was Scientology. It wasn't a 9 to 5 for me for those 17 years. It was a full-time 24/7, 365 operation.
For $50 a week.
Mm-hmm.
24/7, 365 for $50 a week.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah. I was dedicated. I was devoted. And I was a true believer in every sense of the word. I'd grown up with this. Even when I wanted to leave, I still believed in it. So it wasn't a crisis of faith in Scientology as a subject that caused me to leave. It was the crisis of faith in the organization of Scientology and David Miscavige's leadership. He's the current leader of Scientology. That was what I had a problem with.
And that's interesting. 'Cause I've spoken with a number of like ex priests or pastors or ministers, rabbis and such, and the what you've just said is very reminiscent of that. They still believed, at least for a while, and some of them even to this day, they still believe in God, but they didn't believe in their church anymore, in the human
Right.
organization underneath it. Uh, and it's it seems to be another way in which Scientology and mainstream religions are very much alike.
Well, very much so. And in fact, I think you'll find, I have found this to be true, that the number one way or route that Scientologists will tend to start waking up and criticizing and looking into the organization is because they end up having a problem with David Miscavige or with the leadership of Scientology or what the leadership structure is doing, more so than they're having a problem with L. Ron Hubbard or his dogmatic teachings. And that tends to be the first point of weakness, or the first area where people start going, hey, wait a second, something's not quite right here. That's not right. Or that's not what L. Ron Hubbard says to do in his writings, but here he is doing it. What's up with that? And they start questioning, gross hypocrisies that they're looking at. And certainly in other churches that would be true too, because the core dogma of the group is unassailable at that point in the person's journey. They can't question the dogma, but they can question application of the dogma. They can question misuse of the dogma. They can question abusive behavior that they see that's clearly abusive. They go, well, wait a second, that doesn't make sense. And that's exactly how most Scientologists start waking up.
Right.
And
So
and to be clear,
Yeah.
I am fully out now. I'm just telling you my journey
Yeah,
out.
yeah.
It was,
So you passed your 8 or 9 month security review,
yep.
and what happened next?
Well, I basically got permission to leave, and I did. And I was authorized to do so because I went through that whole process because I intended on continuing on my Scientology journey.
Right.
It's multi-layered and a little complicated. The story is a little involved, so I'm trying to just give the overview here. But basically, in 2013, having gotten out of the Sea organization and having moved to Minnesota, and I was going to carry on with Scientology services there, and I was going to connect with this woman I had met out there who was a Scientologist that I very, very much had fallen in love with, and I was divorcing my wife, and there was all kinds of layers to this. It wasn't just about that relationship. All this stuff about Scientology was actually the much bigger problem in my life at this time. And leaving the Sea Org was a gigantically life-altering decision. It changed everything in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to start a family. I wanted to have a regular job and a regular life. It was much, much, much more than just, a relationship. And so I quit the Sea Org. And then I had unfettered access to the internet. And that's where everything fell apart, right? Because in a group like Scientology, and we've really barely scratched the surface of its abusive behaviors, there's a modeling that is used to describe destructive cults called the bite model. It's one of many models that can be used to explain how cult dynamics work. And the bite model is simple and easy to understand, which is why we like to use it, right? It's behavior, information, thought, and emotional control. Those 4 things. And information control is absolutely crucial to a cult operation. If it's a destructive cult, it's engaging in information control. And the way they did that, as for us as Sea Org members, was we were denied access to the internet. We just didn't have it. And we didn't have personal phones or access or anything like that. Nobody was running around with Apple phones and or iPhones or Androids or any of that. Gradually, filtered access to the internet was introduced to the Sea Org at certain levels, but it was filtered in the same way the CCP filters Chinese internet. There's literally sites you can't go to, words you can't look up. Scientology has a whole laundry list of confidential things they don't want their members knowing about. So I never had that open access. I had a little tiny bit of access in order to be able to skip trace and find people who I was trying to recover. And I had seen little bits and pieces through that access, but not anything enough to really give me the picture of what was really going on. So after I got out, being the inquisitive, curious person that I've always been, I couldn't help it. I started looking at stuff on the internet. And the more I learned, the more shocked and appalled I was. And I learned things that had happened in my own history with other Scientologists who had long since left and had gone on to tell their story. And I was now able to access that information. And I learned things about, my own past and about the past of L. Ron Hubbard and about Scientology that I had never, ever had access to before. This was monumentally important, and it totally rocked my entire world. I mean, I remember this is stuff I had grown up with. I had never questioned certain principles of L. Ron Hubbard's life story and the church's history, and I was now seeing documentation that was proving to me all of it was a lie. L. Ron Hubbard had never suffered war wounds. L. Ron Hubbard had never graduated university. L. Ron Hubbard had been married to 2 women at the same time, knowingly, for a year. I mean, that's just not an accident. He had abandoned his children. I mean, one of his children suicided. I mean, there were all kinds of things I had been completely in the dark about. And this really opened my eyes to the importance of transparency and informed consent. You need to let people know what you're about. And Scientology was doing the exact opposite. Not only were they hiding the truth, they were outright lying about it. And the lies were significant. And they really, in a matter of about 3 months, 3 or 4 months, I deconstructed my entire life. I mean, everything that I thought was real and true was suddenly not real and not true. And I can't really describe to you the emotional impact of something like that. As I used to say, I was pissed. I was very, very mad. And I felt very, very betrayed. And so that was the real turning point in my life. And that came around June, May or June of 2013. And everything changed after that. And that leaving...
That sounds like the famous Ernest Hemingway quotation, "How did you go bankrupt?" And he responds 2 ways: slowly, then all at once. And it seems like that's in a different context that describes your leaving the church. You left very slowly and then all at once, or
that's a great analogy, actually. And that's actually that way with most cult members. Sometimes it's explosive and violent and awful as far as the separation or the breakup, but often it is a slow burn, and then suddenly whoa, as all the truth comes crashing down on a person. And that was all 10 years ago. And it's been 10 years of recovery for me since then. And I have documented that basically on my channel. That's what I've been doing the last 10 years is figuring out what the hell happened to me, what was done to me, why was it done, and how
let me give you a chance at some self-promotion. So I want to move away from Scientology.
Sure, yeah.
But before we do, if people want to find out more about your story and about more about Scientology and what you learned about it, where should they go to find out? Where
my channel. Absolutely. I have a number of playlists and videos put together that break down Scientology, the basics of it as a subject, tear it all apart. And then I have my story. And I've gone on record very, very completely. I mean, the entire story is like 12 hours. And I don't know that anybody wants to, it's not one video, it's a series of them. But there's lots of snippets and bits and pieces all throughout my channel.
So I'll provide a link to your YouTube channel in the show notes, and people can go there. People can go there for more information and more details. I'd like to talk about what you've done in the past 10 years of your life? Because you've done a lot more than just recover from from the previous decade spent within the organization of
Yes.
Scientology. You've really dedicated your life to building something in those 10 years, and I'd like I, and that's what I'd like to talk to you about for the
Sure.
rest of today's episode. So once you were out, you basically hadn't done anything except work for Scientology in your whole life. What how do you go from where you were there to where you are today, and how did you choose the direction of where you wanted to go with your life at that point?
Well, that's really that's a great question because it's changed over the years. You know, I didn't start out coming out of Scientology thinking, "Oh yeah, I'm going to be a church critic. That's what I'm going to do." There was no idea that that's where my life was going to go. I envisioned when I left Scientology that I was going to start a family, get married, you know, do this whole thing, continue in Scientology. Well, after finding out that was all nonsense, I have always had a very strong streak to be the guy who's doing something about it, to try to step up and say something and make a difference. And that's what had impelled me to be such a dedicated Scientologist for so many decades. Is I was hardcore about helping people. So, of course, that purpose didn't go away, and I wanted to do something that was going to be significant and important in educating or informing people so they didn't make the same mistakes I did or my parents did or so many other people did joining destructive cults like that. So, and also, again, trying to answer the question, and the very important question, what the hell happened to me? What was all that? How did that happen? How did I become so stupid? And of course, it's not a matter of stupidity. It's a matter of emotional investment. And that's what I have come to learn. Trying to first document, you know, the ills of Scientology, and then learning. This was a real big day for me. I was just talking to somebody about this last night, how important this was, is when you first come out of a group like Scientology or Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons or Moonies or some other destructive cult situation, it can take a while to realize that what happened to you was not unique. I thought for a very long time as a former Scientologist, oh, my experience is so unique and different. Nobody can understand it, and nobody will ever be able to get their wits around it. And it's so weird and it's so crazy. And the more I learned about L. Ron Hubbard and how he did what he did, the more I learned. One day it hit me like, oh, wait a second. The same things he's doing are what Jim Jones did, or what David Koresh did, or what Marshall Applewhite did, the whole Heaven's Gate thing where they did the mass suicide. That these cult leaders all do the exact same things. They just use different language and slightly different techniques, but the methods they're using and the principles that they're taking advantage of in our psychology are the same. And suddenly the light dawned, and I was like, oh my God, there's really only so many ways you can go about controlling somebody and preying on them. And that's what these cult leaders, these predatory personalities, that's what they have made a specialization out of doing. They are students of human psychology and manipulation. And the tool bag, the toolkit, is about 8 or 9 things that they're basically manipulating and controlling in people. And again, the language can be different. It can be very flowery. It can be very blunt. The methods can be simple or they can be complicated in appearance, but what they're doing is same. And you start realizing that there's a thing called a cult leader playbook. And that's how I started talking about it, is there's a playbook. There's things they do. And that actually was a big deal for me as a recovering cult member, because suddenly I could share my story and my experiences and my understanding with other people, even ex-members of other faiths and groups, even ex-members of non-religious cults. And I could immediately find common ground, and we could relate, and we could help each other in the recovery and understanding of what had happened to us.
Let me ask you to expand on that, because when I hear I mean, a lot of what you're describing, I mean, it applies equally to cults and religions. I just listened to a different podcast. It's called Canada Land, and they were talking about the Brethren, which is a
Mm-hmm.
Christian sect, but the amount of control that they exert over their followers sounded very like almost identical to what you were describing in Scientology. But when I hear the word cult, it's always a with a religious connotation. And
Yes.
and you just said that like non-religious cults, and I can you what like, I'm trying to think, like, is this like loyalty to a company? Is this beyond reason? Is this loyalty to a political faction, or what is a non-religious cult? Because you're expanding the use of that word great in a way that I haven't heard used before.
Oh, fantastic. Well, let me tell you about this then, because first off, I am expanding my use of the term destructive cult because I want to be clear that the word cult doesn't necessarily in and of itself have a bad connotation. There's lots of definitions for culty activities that are not abusive or predatory. But destructive cult makes it clear we're talking about a group that's not got your best interests in mind. And there are exact characteristics for a group that we label or diagnose as a destructive cult. And religion and religious belief is not part of it. Fervent belief in the activity or agenda or leadership is what is required. And anybody can incite or provoke fervent belief. Sports activities, martial arts dojos, acting classes, businesses. Nexium, for example, is something you might have heard about recently, which was a sort of self-empowerment group that was run by this guy, Keith Raniere. And he's in jail now for 120 years because he was a very bad boy and committed gross sexual liberties with his female clients, his female followers. And he had set up various groups within this sort of self-help business consultation activity. And he started, sexual activities. So that's a destructive cult. That's fervent belief surrounded around charismatic leadership using coercive control techniques of isolation, manipulation, and control to enact your will on your followers. That's pretty much a destructive cult situation or description. And it follows the same dynamics as a predatory or abusive relationship, or the same kind of dynamics you see in human trafficking or labor trafficking. The control mechanisms are the same. And that's what I've, gone on to learn so much about in pursuing the answer to the question, what the hell happened to me in Scientology? Well, coercive control happened. And there's a model for this, and there's ways you can break this behavior down. And it's not just in religious settings that this happens. It's very, very easy and very, very common for coercive control situations to pop up in religious settings. Happens all the time.
Right, because once you have the infallibility of a leader, a lot of that stuff follows.
You got it. But it's far from only a religious context that this happens.
Okay.
Anywhere where you have a codependent relationship between a leader-follower dynamic, you have a potential for cultic abuse, right? Because codependency is not a positive thing. You don't want to be codependent where people are so reliant on one another that their very identity becomes confused with the other person. And that's where we get with the cult leader, cult follower relationship.
Is that really codependent? Like from your description, it really seems like the dependence is one way. It's not that the leader is defined by each individual follower. The way the follower is absolutely dependent on and subservient to the leader. Or am I misunderstanding what codependent means?
No, you are understanding it fine, and I am using it exactly the way you're describing. But let me tell you more about this. Is the leader is very much dependent on the followers. The leader is a human being with his own emotional needs and wants and desires and dreams and goals and ideals. And it just so happens that his psychological makeup is such that he doesn't see other human beings as fully realized people. They are tools to be utilized. And yet he has to have them in his life for him to feel fulfilled and purposeful and successful.
So I, as a charismatic leader, am only as good as my number of followers. So it's not that I need you, Chris Shelton, in order to feel like I'm doing okay, but I need a plethora of followers, of whom you are one, in order for me to feel good. Whereas you are requiring me as an individual to be your be all and end all, and your cult leader in that sense.
Yeah, it's something similar to that. You do have cult leaders who will develop personal and very, very significant and important relationships with key followers that they have. But a characteristic of a predatory personality, like a David Miscavige and L. Ron Hubbard, is that they will lose people as quickly as they gain them. The need for any one individual is not so great with these people. They do need numbers of people, and often they're operating on some agenda that is completely secret and hidden from their followers. That their followers are somehow tools for this cult leader to use to realize the secret or hidden goal. For example, what I mean by that is, like, let's talk about L. Ron Hubbard for a second. He had his own personal goal or purpose of godhood. And he sells Scientology as this methodology for everybody to attain godhood. But actually, L. Ron Hubbard was a practitioner of the occult. So there's a whole other layer underneath all of this that is not about personal empowerment for the followers. It's all about twisting them around spiritually. And that is what gives L. Ron Hubbard power. It's a really weird thing. L. Ron Hubbard was a pretty twisted thinker, but the point I'm making is there can be hidden agendas going on that the followers don't know anything about, but they are very much a part of by the very existence that they're there, if that makes sense.
Okay, so there's potential cult followings in like all kinds of areas of life, as you've just as you've just mentioned, and something that I've noticed is that when I was young, when I was a teenager, and I heard about cults, it's like, well, there's idiots everywhere in the world. You're never going the world is never going to be free of idiots. So there's always going to be people in cults, because some people are dumb, and so they're going to fall for dumb things. And but I was a teenager. I'm being honest with you.
Totally.
But it's clear that your level of education, your level of intelligence, your level of independence, and overall capabilities have at most a very small role to play in who is susceptible to becoming a part of a cult. And I mean, I know how I came to that conclusion, but there might be people out there who represent or are closer to my teenage self than to my current self. And so I'd like you to sort of explain how, even someone like yourself, who's clearly an intelligent, articulate, thoughtful person, could spend the majority of his life in an organization like Scientology, and how other people who are also intelligent, educated, accomplished individuals can still fall for a cult figure of some type or another.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite things to talk about, because I have to poke holes in everybody's egos. It's hilarious. It really is. What you've said and described is par for the course. Everybody thinks this way, and I've come to learn why they have to. And so yeah, let's talk about this. Probably the most common refrain, right, when you hear about cults is, "Oh, you have to be a moron to join a cult. What a bunch of idiots," And this is, of course, is hindsight bias writ large. I mean, I've now told you everything about why this group is awful and horrible, and now you're going to judge everybody who's in it because they don't know what I just told you, and they somehow should. And it's hilarious, right? Because it's like, okay, people don't get caught up in this because they're stupid. In fact, statistically speaking, you are more likely to get caught up in a cult situation the higher your intelligence is, not lower. Dumb people are not people who fall for cults. They can't think their way through it. It doesn't make any sense to them. They go, that's stupid, and they walk away. I saw it so many times. But intelligent people can invent their own reasons why your nonsense actually makes sense.
So I being a smart people can do a better job at rationalizing the contradictions.
Exactly. And the reason why they would feel compelled to do that is nothing to do with intelligence. It has to do with emotional investment. And the world is suffering right now from a very serious lack of emotional intelligence and an understanding and awareness of our emotional life and what emotions are and how they affect us. And of course, and no exception to this, for many, many years, I thought critical thinking alone, logic, rhetoric, reasoning, thinking things through, logical fallacies. I thought for sure that was the one solution, one and done. You figure out critical thinking, you apply it in your life, you're going to be golden. Nobody's ever going to fool you ever again. And the thing that's missing from that equation, and it's a big, huge thing, is the emotion side of this, the emotional component. You have got to understand your emotions and your
We are
emotional
thinking
life.
and feeling apes.
Yes. And our feelings, what I've come to learn through an incredibly long time studying this stuff, I mean, it has been a decade, is, I've interviewed on my channel, I don't just talk about cults, I've interviewed psychologists, sociologists, neuroscientists. I've gone deep on this. And the thing about emotions is that they are the thing that rule your life, not your intellect. Your rationality and your frontal lobes pretty much exist to rationalize your existence. They don't exist to logic your way through life. That's not the creatures we are. We react to things. We have responses to things, and those responses can be powerful influencers. When we are mad, when we are, very, very angry, when we are very, very sad, when we are very, very depressed, this radically affects our behavior, but it also radically affects our entire worldview. When you're depressed, everything is glum and horrible and awful and black and bleak and couldn't ever possibly be any good. What's that?
And yes, everything is terrible, awful, and it's never going to get better. This is the best it's ever going to be. It's only getting worse from here.
That's right. Okay. So if you so think for a moment, if you were somebody who could create that emotional state in another human being, you control them to a degree that is almost unparalleled compared to if you tried to reason them into something. If I could control your emotional state, I would have a far better chance of correctly predicting what you're going to do than if I tried to reason you into something. Who knows what you're going to come back at me with? But if I get you mad,
reason somebody out of a proposition that they didn't reason themselves into.
Well, exactly. And that's the thing, is it cults very, very much in the recruitment phase of all of this. And I'm sorry if I'm going a little all over the place in this answer, but basically in a cult recruitment phase and in a cult retention situation where they're trying to keep you on board, the most powerful tools they have at their disposal are emotional manipulation of you. Not logicking you into it or logicking you out of it. It's emotionally manipulating you in or out of something. And this is far easier to do than most people give credit to it, because they don't understand their own emotions and emotional needs. And we all have them. And this is something that that I really needed to get educated on and study in order to really to kind of get my head around, right? Is there's nothing wrong with having emotional needs. We all have ego. We all have a need for agency, for compassion, for community, for mutual support, for independence. We have to be able to, take off and get away from people for a little while. All of these are emotional needs that we have, and these are features. They're not bugs. There's not some problem in us that we have an emotional life. But not knowing we have that, and not knowing that they are needs in the same way that eating and sleeping are needs, like these are not options. Once
Right.
you recognize that, then you realize that these needs can be manipulated. If you are in, let's say, for example, a traumatized or mournful state, you're in a position of change in your life where things are shaky or uncertain, or you're not really sure what your new environment is. Maybe you've moved to a new town, or
New
you're
job,
going you're
death
going
of
to
a loved
college.
one, marriage collapsing. Yeah.
You're right. You leave a marriage. You have a baby. You lose a parent. I mean, there's so many massive changes that happen to us in our lives that can cause us to feel uncertain or shaky, or we're not quite sure how to predict what's going to happen in the future, and we're suffering or upset about a loss or this trauma. That puts us in a vulnerable state,
Mm-hmm.
and it doesn't matter how smart you are. That doesn't enter into it. You could be a PhD, MD, doctor of philosophy. It doesn't matter. If you feel how you feel, those feelings are overpowering and overwhelming. And if you're looking for help in dealing with those feelings, well, there's an awful lot of groups out there that are willing to extend you a helping hand and say, oh, we'll help you. And sometimes that help is real and honest, and sometimes it's not. And we have a very hard time when we're in an emotional, needy state differentiating what are the red flags? How do we see them? What do we even know? If you're not educated in those.
And after a while, you say, well, I've been with this group for 6 months or a year or 2 years, and I've given them all of this time and energy and possibly money. And I'm a smart guy. So clearly they must be on the up and up, because I wouldn't have done that if they weren't on the up and up, because I'm smart enough to tell the difference.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So there's a number of self-reinforcing, mechanisms here in our mind to tell us we're doing the right thing. That's again an emotional need, the feeling of certainty and the feeling that we not only have agency, but that we're using it effectively to improve ourselves or get along in life. We have to feel that way. Otherwise, we'd be blithering, idiots in an insane asylum all day, because we'd be shaking and racked with uncertainty and doubt about every move we're making. So these built-in things are important to our survival, but they can be taken advantage of. And that's how it happens. That's basically, in a nutshell, how people get recruited into cults, is they are emotionally taken advantage of.
Clearly, no one goes out seeking to be part of a cult, and you've just explained how anybody at some point in their lives, or at various points in their lives, becomes susceptible to the charms and enter into it. So if someone is in a coercive relationship with an individual or an organization, or they suspect they might be, because they might not be clear, but they suspect, wait a sec, what if perhaps this isn't the right thing? How can you guide people? Like, it took you years, you said, from when you first started expressing some doubts just to yourself to when you actually left for good. And how can one tell whether that offer for help when you're in an emotionally vulnerable state is genuine, or if it's comes with strings, or a price that will be paid later, or if you've already paid the price? How can you encourage people to awaken to the fact that they might be in a coercive relationship without the false positive of, no, this is actually healthy, but I'm worried about it anyway? How can you tell the difference?
Right. Okay. So on the surface, you might not necessarily be able to right away. There are not, big flashing lights announcing, hey, destructive occult ahead, right? If anything, exactly the opposite. The good ones, the ones that have been doing it for decades, are very, very good at what they do. And they present a very pleasing and very calm and very measured, first impression. That's their whole goal, is to impress you with how great and together and all that they are. Whether it's some pseudoscientific guru, or whether it's Scientology, or whether it's the Mormons or whatever. Um, I just did a podcast on this, actually. It's kind of funny. So basically, there's two pieces of advice I can give people as to like how to stay out of a cult. And both of these require attention and mindfulness. You got to keep your head together, with yourself, because if you find yourself in a situation where you are being emotionally manipulated, it's not always going to be super obvious or clear to you unless you have some discipline set aside in yourself to always kind of keep a little bit of an eye on yourself and what you're doing, right? And for example, sometimes some of us are not very good at that. Well, if you're going to go check out a new group or a new activity, or you're looking at joining or getting involved in something, bring a friend. Bring somebody with you who can kind of be a, voice of reason for you, or maybe not be as involved as you might be. There's lots of little tricks you can do, all in the direction of keeping your head about you. What you want to do is basically avoid emotional intensity. Because that's what they're trying to rile up in you to get you on board, right? There's this thing that I analogize to. I think all of us can relate to what it feels like to fall in love. It's amazing. Nothing feels better. It's euphoric. It's awe-inspiring. It's fervent. And you can feel similar shades or harmonics of that, or parallels with that, when you're in a big group setting where everybody's on the same page. This is why people really get off on going to sporting events or concerts or group activities where everybody is kind of together and one, and it feels amazing.
Yes.
That is the exact feeling that somebody in a destructive cult recruitment situation is trying to create in you. So if you find yourself feeling that way, you might want to be like, hang on a second here, hold on. Now, it's not 100%, and there's various shades of this, and there are other ways people get involved in cults, but this tends to be the number one way, which is why I talk about it the most, is this emotional manipulation. So having some emotional awareness, or what pilots call situational awareness, where you're kind of always mindful of your surroundings, that is the number one thing that's going to save your butt in any number of situations, including getting involved in a cult. And the other thing is, and this is the thing that people fall down on routinely, and then this is why I have to pump it up, and I got to say, look, I know it's not easy, and I know this is a pain in the ass sometimes. And when you're feeling really excited and really good about something, you want to get going on it. You don't want to have any time involved. But the thing is, again, this is a discipline point. If you're looking at joining or becoming part of or giving money to something, give yourself time. Give yourself a day or two. However good it is today, it's going to be just as good tomorrow, or the next day, or the next day.
In sales, one of the primary commandments of sales is create a sense of urgency.
Exactly.
And
this is the counter to that.
Yes, right. You don't want to give people, we'll be selling the same product next week and next month, next year, so buy whenever you want to buy. No. I can give you 5% off, but we need to close it today.
Exactly.
I can only hold your spot in line until the end of this week. Like that's not cult behavior, but that is like sales 101. So it seems like a similar technique. And
it's the exact same technique, and it comes out of sales. This is the Dale Carnegie, right? This is this whole thing, right? How to win friends and influence people and all that. America got sold on everybody being a salesperson like about 100 years ago, and our entire society is now built around this sales personality, and everybody's an influencer and everybody's a salesperson. And so this is kind of sunk into the very fabric of our culture, and so we're also kind of used to it. We all kind of, what's the big deal? But it is a big deal because it's emotional manipulation.
Yeah. And the bringing a friend, I was speaking a couple months ago with a scientist who wrote a book on uncritical thinking. And what he said, and you were talking about people's egos, that we all have biases. We all think with a number of fallacies. And so with training, you can catch yourself a little bit on some things, but that's why there's peer review, because I I make mistakes in my thinking, you make your mistakes in your thinking, and other people make mistakes in their thinking. But if we all look at the same data together, my biases are different than your fallacies, which are different than the other person's blind spots. So together, we can actually come to something approximating the truth. And I guess if by bringing a friend, those emotional tricks that really work on me, the key past your defenses are different, and so you'll be able to see it in a way that I would not. Is that a fair, I'm trying to draw connections here, but I don't want to draw false connections.
No, you're nailing it. That's exactly right. Everything you just said is 100% spot on as to why I'm saying what I'm saying. The other factor here is there's the bring a friend strategy. The other, even if you can't do that, or that's impossible for some reason, the other thing you can know and apply here is the three components of coercive control: isolation, manipulation, and control. The control is achieved only after the victim has been isolated and manipulated. So don't let yourself be isolated. Don't find yourself alone in a room with 10 people around you trying to sell you on this thing. Don't even let yourself in a room with 2 people. When it's 2-on-1, you're like, hey, man, we're going out front again, and I only want to talk to one of you. It's seriously, like, that's actually important, because that isolation factor has psychological implications that are very, very powerful to our thinking.
Okay.
This is called love bombing, right? Where they adore you and love you and tell you how wonderful and smart and intelligent you are for being
keep
here.
Going. I really like where you're going with this.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like that whole thing. It's ego boosting is another way you could describe it. Right. We call it love bombing. That happens when they isolate you. They get you away from everybody, and then they start pumping your ego like crazy. And who doesn't like that?
Yeah.
Everybody likes that. We all want that.
Yes.
And they'll give it to you, because that's the ticket to getting you to give up your individuality.
Wow. Well, Chris, this has been wonderful. I can so much of what we've said, I want to get into more detail, but we've been going for a little over an hour now, and I think that that's a good note to end on. Do you have any last thoughts on anything that we've talked about today?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot to know about this. Education is the key to staying out of destructive cult or manipulative situations. It really is. There's no substitute for it. Believe me, I have spent years doing this, educating myself and other people about it. And the people who are constantly running into trouble in life, who are going back into cult situations, who find themselves in a string of bad relationships, are generally speaking uneducated. They are not stupid people. They are not, morons. They're not malicious, but they just don't know what to look for. And they'll run into the same wall again and again and again. And you'd think, hey, man, but it's because they haven't been educated. So I really can't stress enough. You pick up a book, watch some videos. If you want to know about this and you're really serious about keeping yourself and your family and friends safe, learn more about it, either through my channel or the numerous other people out there who are putting up really good content about how cults work.
Right. Well, we'll link to your website and your YouTube channel in the show notes. I encourage people that want to find out more, please do so. Chris, thanks for all the work that you've done. It is important, and I'm sure it brings great comfort to those that who need it. Thanks for your time, Chris. I appreciate it.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Links for today's discussion can be found in the show notes. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please subscribe and engage in the conversation. Comment, rate, and review. Email us at podcast@centerforinquiry.ca. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada. We are a national educational charity supporting reason, compassion, and secular values. To our supporters, thank you. If you have not yet contributed, please consider making a donation at centerforinquiry.ca/donate or becoming a member at centerforinquiry.ca/join. Your contribution supports our efforts to have rational and evidence-based decision-making everywhere. CFIC is on the web at centerforinquiry.ca. We are on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Lee Shields, Zach Dumont, and Martin Zielinski. Music by Anthony Lazaro. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood. See you next time.